Hey, you guys, it's Kim. Welcome back to the Control Variable. So, I have a friend here in the Hudson Valley named Saul Schisler. He's an artist and a hunter. We go kayaking together sometimes. When I had bronchitis last March, Saul showed up with a pot of what he calls Jewish penicillin, also known as homemade chicken soup, and a big hunk of bread still warm from the oven. He's that kind of guy. Saul's also a serious outdoorsman. He ice fishes, spends most of his fall weekends up in the mountains, hunting for deer and bears, squirrels, turkeys. And just to give you the full picture, Saul will shoot a deer, butcher it by himself, and then emerge from his kitchen a week later with ropes of venison jalapeno poblano sausages. I'm not kidding. So I don't know, maybe Renaissance outdoorsman is a better description for Saul? Or Renaissance outdoorsman spawn of YouTube? Anyway, as you may have guessed, Saul owns a bunch of guns. He won't tell me how many, but it's a lot. He uses them mostly for hunting, but he also just really likes shooting them. When I told him I didn't like guns, he said, "That's because you've never shot one." But I actually have shot a gun before. My dad loved guns. He had a lot of them, and he was a great shot. He was the kind of guy who could win you the biggest stuffed bear at a carnival. You know those huge ones that hang above the shooting gallery, the ones no one ever wins? My dad could win those. And I know he hoped I'd love guns too. He gave me a BB gun for my 7th birthday, though I asked for a tutu. He took me to the firing range, tried to teach me how to shoot. I hated the whole thing. The noise, the explosions, the smoke. While my dad was busy shooting, I remember crouching down with my hands over my ears thinking, this place is going to blow up. Needless to say, I haven't touched a gun since then. Which doesn't mean I'm against guns. I respect hunters and their desire for guns. But every time I hear about another mass shooting in this country, I find myself thinking, how are semi-automatic weapons still legal? How are people still allowed to buy them from private dealers at gun shows without any background checks? And please tell me why anyone needs a Hellfire trigger, if not to shoot large numbers of people as quickly as possible. So Saul and I are friends. And one day while we were out kayaking this summer, maybe 6 weeks after the school shooting in Uvalde, we got to talking about semi-automatic weapons. He looked at me and said, "You just can't imagine how much fun it is to shoot them." Later that afternoon, I realized I wanted to have Saul come talk to me here on the Control Variable, because we have really different feelings about guns, really different experiences with guns, and really different opinions about guns. But we're also both horrified by all the gun violence that goes on in this country. We both really want it to stop. And look, there's reason to be hopeful, right? President Biden passed a major federal gun safety law this summer after the Uvalde shooting. A law that expands background checks for people under 21 who are trying to buy guns, and prohibits people who've been convicted of domestic violence from buying a gun for 5 years after their conviction. The law put billions of dollars towards mental health programs in schools and community-based violence prevention initiatives. And it put $750 million towards state grants that put what are known as red flag laws into place. In a nutshell, red flag laws allow authorities to take guns away from people if the court decides they're a danger to themselves or to others. So this is a big deal. It's the first major federal gun safety law that Congress has passed in 26 years. But it doesn't ban the sale of semi-automatic weapons, which are basically what make mass shootings possible. Maybe most alarmingly, it doesn't ban this thing called the Hellfire Stealth, which is very similar to a bump stock. Do you know what a bump stock is? Basically, it makes a semi-automatic rifle, like an AR-15, fire incredibly fast, almost as fast as a machine gun. And if I wanted to, I could go buy one of those on the internet right now for $49.99. So yeah, I'm not sure how much good this new gun law is going to do. According to the Pew Research Center, most Americans aren't sure either. Neither Republicans nor Democrats who are polled think it will do much to prevent gun violence. And almost 60% of the Republicans who are polled don't think the law will have any impact on gun violence at all. So here are some stats. As of this recording, the Gun Violence Archive says more than 32,000 people have been killed by gun violence in this country in 2022 alone. There have been 500 mass shootings, 237 children, and almost 1,000 teens have been killed by gun violence just in 2022. So I wanted to talk to Saul about what he thinks of our gun laws here in America, and to try and understand more about his relationship with guns, why he likes them so much, why he wants them in his life. Because Saul doesn't fit the stereotype of a gun nut. Not the kind you read about in the media, at least. Yes, he grew up in Texas, but he's also a Jew who grew up in Texas. Yes, he hunts, but he also went to art school in Brooklyn. He makes gigantic metal sculptures behind his house. So he's complex. The way I think most of us are complex. All of us, really. And I wondered if Saul and I took the time to talk through this whole gun thing together and really listen to each other's perspectives. If we might be able to find some common ground, just reach across the divide a little bit. So here's my conversation with Saul. I wanted to ask you, about your relationship to guns growing up. Were there guns in your family? How did you come to experience guns? What's the first time you shot a gun? I don't know. Trying to get a sense of the culture, the culture that was sort of in your household and stuff.
Yeah. So one of my grandfathers was a police officer. He died before I was born, but my dad grew up in a house that had firearms.
In Texas?
In New York, actually.
In New York, okay.
In Yonkers.
Oh, in Yonkers? God, I grew up in Bronxville.
Oh,
crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. My dad grew up in Yonkers.
Mm-hmm.
So he grew up familiar with firearms. He didn't own any, but when I was a kid, he would take us to the range and we would rent guns, and he taught my sister and I, how to operate a revolver safely. Starting at what age, do you know? I don't know, maybe 10 years old or something.
Okay.
And then also my other grandfather had guns.
Okay.
All of his firearms were his brother's. When his brother passed, he inherited them.
Okay.
So, but he had, a couple hunting rifles, he had a shotgun, and he had his brother's service pistol from World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So at a young age, I remember going to the range with that grandfather and shooting, long guns and the pistol.
Sure. Starting at 10 or?
Yeah, somewhere in there, maybe a little bit older.
Yeah, okay. What did you like as a kid about them? When did they start to become something that you, wanted to make part of your life? And what do you like about them?
At my synagogue when I was a kid, there was a guy there who was in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Mm-hmm.
So, at an early age, I was exposed to these Jews in Poland had to get guns on the black market and defend themselves.
Gotcha.
And I was always kind of flabbergasted at the amount of people that just walked willingly into the gas chambers.
Sure.
So that's kind of always been a reality that I've been aware of, especially being a Jewish kid in Texas.
Sure, of course.
Feeling like an outsider from a pretty young age.
Do you have a memory of going shooting with your granddad, or that is particularly that you could tell me what that meant to you? What?
Yeah. Okay. So the last
Mm-hmm.
time I shot my great uncle's service pistol with my grandfather, I was probably 20. I went home to visit the family, and I had started operating this metalworking machinery. So I understood how, I could see the marks on this firearm that were, it was manufactured 100 years ago at the end of World War I.
Right.
So my grandpa and I were looking at this thing as we were cleaning it after we'd shot it. And I was able to tell him oh, this block of metal would have been held like this, and the cutter would have come in like this. And, that's a pretty vivid memory. Him and my dad both were big on gun safety and understanding how to operate each firearm.
Right.
Because each platform is different, A semi-automatic pistol functions differently than a revolver.
Yeah.
Functions differently than a shotgun.
Right. What do you like about firing guns? And what do you like about firing different guns? What is that? What is the pleasure of it?
Yeah. I think that, it's something kind of primal. It's the same type of enjoyment that I get from shooting my bow.
Right. Okay.
In that it's both a utilitarian skill, but it's also enjoyable to do and to try to get better at. I don't enjoy it so much that I'm going to go be that I'm going to compete, but I do like shooting. I understand the mechanics of the machine.
Do you get a rush of power from shooting one?
I don't feel powerful, but I appreciate the power of the object.
Okay. Interesting.
It's not like I'm getting off on feeling invincible when I have a firearm in my hand.
Okay.
But I do appreciate the power of the object in the same way that I appreciate the power and, respect the danger of using a table saw.
Sure.
Or a welding machine.
Yeah. You spend a lot of your life working with dangerous objects.
Totally.
Yeah. No, that's really, really good that you pointed that out, because that helps me understand more about it.
Yeah. And maybe that's the reason I don't own an AR, is because I'm not like fetishizing these objects. You know, if I lived in a more gun-friendly state, I might own an AR.
What would be the appeal of having one?
They're a lot of fun to shoot.
Why are they fun to shoot?
Because you don't have to reload as often, and it's a cheaper bullet than my hunting rifles.
And those are the only reasons? There's no speed difference?
No, semi-automatic is semi-automatic. As fast as you can pull the trigger.
What is the utilitarian argument to be made for an AR-15 with hunting, though?
I mean, I think that like the most like demographic that's going to be using ARs is people that are shooting feral hogs, because they're
is that kind of a thing in Texas? There are lots of feral hogs
in the South. Yeah.
Wow.
And all over. I mean, in California too. I have a friend that worked on a farm in California, and there was a giant wild boar. So if you think about a deer will produce like 1 to 3 fawns once per year.
Right.
Wild feral hogs, they have multiple litters a year. And I think the litter size can be like, you know, anywhere from like 8 to 12. And they do massive damage to, you know, agriculture and to habitat.
Right.
So that's why it's legal for, like, in some states, maybe in Texas, I don't know about Texas, where like you'll see people do like helicopter hunts and shit like that.
Right. Okay.
Which I don't really have any interest in. If I was going to go feral hog hunting, I'd be doing it for the meat, you know?
Yeah, sure.
But I do have a friend that worked on a farm in California, and that was part of his job, is he had to go
shoot the feral hogs. He had
to go shoot these hogs.
Where in California was that?
I don't know. I think in the northern part of the state.
Okay.
But you know, they would like come in. You know, they're big.
I know they are. Yeah.
So they would like bust up the fence and then go like destroy the crops, and it was, you know, it was a massive issue.
Okay.
If semi-automatic rifles were no longer legal, could you go use other guns for that purpose? Sure.
Right.
But in terms of like being on the ground and having multiple animals in front of you that you have to dispatch, having a semi-automatic weapon is going to, like, there's a utilitarian argument.
So it is actually faster. It's just easier. It's going to be easier to kill them.
Yeah, it would be like, I can shoot a semi-automatic gun faster than I can shoot like my lever action or bolt action rifle.
Okay.
But if all of the AR-15s vanished from the US tomorrow, like, forget about the mechanism to make them vanish, whether it's like the military busting down your door or it's a gun buyback or whatever, I don't think that that's going to solve gun violence across the board.
Sure. Obviously, we have a real mental health epidemic going on right now as well, right? Like there's 70 million mentally ill Americans right now.
Yeah. But that's also like a bit of a sticky talking point when it comes to gun violence.
Owning guns? Is it really?
Mental health is like, you know, it's too broad of a term. You know, my wife works in mental health. And so whenever
But what exactly does she do?
She works in housing for adults with mental illnesses.
Okay.
So the problem with gun violence is like a specific sect of the mental health population.
Okay.
You know, so for me to get a long gun, I go into the gun store. I have my driver's license. They do a federal background check on me.
Right.
And they're looking to see if I'm a felon. They're looking to see if I've ever been convicted of any domestic, like any violent crimes.
Right.
And they're looking to see if I've ever been institutionalized against my will.
Right.
So if I ever had a mental episode where a family member, a police officer, a judge said, you have to go to the psychiatric unit, then I'm no longer allowed to own firearms.
Okay.
So that's in place.
But you think that's adequate?
I think that a big deficit is like...
Because to me, that doesn't cover whether someone's sane at the time of buying a firearm at all.
Yeah. So I don't know, like, I think that there should be like a change in the culture of gun store owners, whether it's something legislated or not, like whether it's just like a massive insurance policy that they have to carry if a gun that they sell is used in a shooting or whatever. I think that there should be a change in the culture where they are taking the time to get to know their patrons, you know.
And why would you prefer that to legislature, to the state, putting laws in place? I'm not
saying that I prefer it. I'm just saying that like that there should be a change in the culture. They can legislate all they want, but that's not going to necessarily change people. You know, that's not going to like have buy-in.
That's not true, though.
I tell Saul about a mass school shooting that took place in Scotland back in 1996. 16 kids and a teacher were killed. But by the following year, Parliament had banned private ownership of most handguns and semi-automatic weapons. They'd also instated mandatory registration for shotgun owners. There have been no school shootings in the UK since then.
So the problem in the US is how many illegal guns are on the street and how many...
But that's not the only problem, right? There's also the problem of there being so many legal guns in the street. I mean, I think you're bringing up valid points, but I also think you keep kind of like going around the things that where it's like, well, why shouldn't we have laws in place where someone has to have a mental health evaluation? I mean, you keep saying, well, even if that's done, we're still going to have to change the culture. But what I'm saying is, if I look at England and at Australia, that those are places where the legislature had a huge impact on the culture because a bunch of stuff that had been legal was no longer legal.
Yeah. But in those places, the right to own firearms wasn't seen as like a religious freedom, the way it is in the US.
Right. But I mean,
I think that's really the big issue is that like it's so ingrained in parts of the culture that.
But so, and therefore in your mind, if these laws were put in place, what would happen?
I don't know. I mean, what law? It depends. It depends on how restrictive they are. Like the mental health thing, like that might be a great idea. I'm not saying that's a bad idea or a good idea.
Okay.
That might be a really great idea.
Right.
I could totally get behind that.
Right.
The problem with...
Like you're talking to someone whose dad had 40 guns.
Yeah.
And he loved them.
Yeah.
Right? Like it was like total pry them from his cold dead hand, right? Like he loved them.
Yeah.
I only understood his relationship to guns when I understood that he loved them.
Yeah.
Right? That it was not a rational thing. It was a deep seated like relationship for him.
Yeah.
Right? And primal in the sense that like there was nothing anybody was going to be able to say to convince him that it was a bad idea, right?
Or that he should those firearms.
Right.
Yeah.
My sense is that for a lot of gun owners, like this isn't a rational conversation. This isn't, it's really, really deep, right? Like it's really deeply ingrained in people's identities. And
totally. Yeah.
Okay, but you don't see yourself as that kind of a gun owner.
I mean,
if somebody wanted to take your portrait with your guns, would you? And it weren't like
no, probably not. If the government did like a massive gun grab tomorrow, I would give up my firearms.
Right.
Without any questions asked.
Yeah.
I mean, there would be a lot of questions being asked.
Yeah, you'd be pissed, but you wouldn't fight back.
I wouldn't go run into the woods with my lever action deer rifle and expect there to be any sort of good outcome. You know? I would be like, I really don't want to get there.
Right.
I think that at the end of the day, like, everybody on the left that wants to take all the AR-15s and all the AR-15 owners, they both want the same thing. They don't want any kids to be dying in schools.
Right.
They don't want like young males gunning each other down in the streets of Chicago.
Right.
You know what I mean?
But why don't you think that taking the AR-15s off the market and doing a massive buyback, why do you think that wouldn't be effective? Since it has, we do have this religious obsession with guns in America, but still, I mean, you really think it wouldn't have any impact at all?
I'm not saying it wouldn't have any impact, but I think that you would still see school shootings and you'd still see kids getting shot on the street.
So the number of mass shootings rose by 62% in the year after the governor signed a bill to make it legal for anyone in Texas over the age of 21 to openly carry a gun in public without a permit or a license.
Mass shootings are defined by 4 or more people.
Yeah.
And that includes drive-bys. That includes like urban setting.
Yeah. But I mean, who cares? It's 62%. It's a huge number. Whether it's 3 or 4 people, right? It's like,
but what was that like in the 90s? I think that looked at a larger timeline in the US, I think that the 90s were also like pretty violent. I think that if you look at just like homicides and suicides, I think a lot more of them are happening with pistols, I'm just not sold on
so then,
argument.
The mental health thing is obviously, like for me, I think what seems very clear to me is like the ease with which anybody in a lot of places can buy them, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that I feel like I just straight up, like, I don't think it's going to solve the problem, but I also don't understand why we wouldn't have laws in place, right? And like, why
New York has a law. They just passed a law on the 3rd. Now you have to go through a registration process to buy a semi-automatic rifle.
Okay. But in Texas, we know there's none of that. There's not.
I think like California, Massachusetts, and New York have the strictest gun laws.
Right. I don't know. The idea that I could go to
gun store tomorrow and without any kind of background check, if I were in Texas, and just like buy a semi-automatic.
I think that they have some sort of background check in place.
I mean, right. But it's not much. It's so little. It's okay, but that's not enough. You know, that's not enough, right? Like, just because when someone hasn't committed a federal crime previously doesn't in any way, guarantee that they won't or that they aren't about to.
I mean, I think that most gun owners would, myself included, be more than happy to sign on to a more restrictive.
Exactly.
Buying process.
Right. Okay. So more restrictive.
I don't know what it is, but for sure.
More restrictive buying process, but I more
think
strict mental health.
The legislation and the cultural shift.
But how do you bring about that cultural shift?
I don't know.
No one knows.
$1 million question.
Right.
I was listening to this podcast with this biologist who was doing all these studies on lead ammunition and copper ammunition and what that does to raptors, like the California condor.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And he was saying that they've studied the numbers in hunter groups making the switch from lead to copper.
Okay.
And a cultural shift through education, like boots on the ground education, talking to, rod and gun clubs and showing them the science, somebody that looks like them, that speaks their language, showing them the science and being like, hey, do you like seeing vultures in the sky? Like, do you think that's cool? Do you like red-tailed hawks and bald eagles?
Right.
Make the shift. Right. And we'll even help you buy this more expensive ammo and we'll take you to the range and show you how to sight in your gun because it flies a little differently than the lead. That's more effective than lead ammo bans. Right. Because there's no buy-in.
So I see. So there's you're pro education.
Yeah.
A lot parallel to legislation.
I'm pro-education to the point where the legislation doesn't even have to come about.
That would take a really long time.
It would take a long time, for sure.
I mean, like, when Uvalde happened, like, what did you think?
Those cops shouldn't have been cops. I couldn't believe.
But is that all you thought?
No, I mean, my first reaction to any shooting is like, all right, when are the right and the left going to start going at each other's throats and totally ignore the tragedy on the ground?
Right.
Because that happens every single time. And then it was just like, seeing photos of those kids' faces was just like totally crushing. And then, my next question was like,
why is nobody willing? Right. Yeah.
Why did they feel like this was their only option? You know, like how much horrible pain and suffering were they going through that they decided to go get a gun and go shoot a bunch of kids?
Absolutely. I mean, that's where I come back to the mental health thing. And, the fact that people feel like this is the only way for them to express themselves or the only way for them to get relief, right? That's really what this comes down to. It's like there's something they feel like they really desperately need. Maybe it's just being seen, like there's something that, if you're a shooter, you there's something you want. You feel like maybe it's a sense of power. Maybe it's respect. Probably.
Maybe it's the big middle finger.
That too, of course, because you're going to die most of the time, right?
But the mental health thing is real. I think that like with the Buffalo shooter, I think that it's come out that he was isolating during the pandemic. He was on his computer and he went down like a crazy anti-Semitic, racist rabbit hole.
Right.
And then he decided to kit up, buy all of his gear. Whereas the dude in Uvalde, he stayed local and his family was scared of him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's another thing to,
Well, but you would hope that a mental health evaluation would pick that up, right?
Yeah, one would hope.
I mean, honestly, it's not that hard to pick up when people are like,
unless they're like the worst type of sociopath.
In which they're just totally like.
In which you want to like invite them over for dinner.
That's true.
They seem like such a great person.
Yeah, no, of course.
I am totally, if there was a bill that came out for the mental health thing.
Yeah.
Like if they had a social worker in every gun store.
Yeah.
I'd kick in tax dollars to pay for their salary.
Like, do you worry about the death by 1,000 cuts thing? By which I mean the general stance that the NRA takes in regards to legislation.
Well, I mean, I think that it's probably rooted in economics, in manufacturing. Like it's lucrative to make things that people want to buy. If they want to buy, you know what I mean? Like I think that that's where a lot of that argument is rooted in.
How so?
I mean, if you make a semi-automatic rifle that people love and have this like identity around,
right,
and they're going to shoot it all the time, then that means we can make more rifles and we can make more ammo.
right.
So I think at the root of it, it's an economic argument.
So the argument that you're saying that the argument that people make about death by 1,000 cuts, like, oh, well, if we give on this matter, on this issue, and if we give on this issue, next thing you know, they'll be taking all our guns away.
That's the argument.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but you're saying
if
that
we
that's
give up
not...
the bump stocks, then they're going to come after my granddad's flintlock
Do you
rifle.
worry about that yourself?
Not really. I don't think so.
I don't either, right? I don't really understand where that thinking comes in. It's like, it just feels very knee-jerk. It feels very reactive.
Well, that's the narrative.
It's very paranoid. Yeah. I mean, it's just that idea that there's a government that actually wants to like render the nation helpless and totally powerless, right? Like totally. I mean, I don't think that. I happen to think we have industries that are very interested in making people consume as much as possible. Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think the government is really corrupt in a lot of ways, but I don't think that the government is actively looking to take people's grandfathers' rifles away. Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
I mean,
you can't make that argument.
I'll agree.
Do you know what I'm saying?
I'm like always an optimist, so I'll totally buy into that argument. Like, I want to imagine that as corrupt as the government is, that like the politicians that we have on offer got into it for the right reasons. Maybe they're not in it for the right reasons now,
right?
But some part of them is like an idealist that believes that because of their innate talents, they can make a difference for better.
Do you belong to the NRA?
No.
Why not?
The one time I thought about it was I was reading an ad in an NRA magazine that like in New York, if somebody breaks into my house and I use a firearm to defend myself, my life is over. They can have a typed up, notarized note saying, I'm here to kill Saul Schisler. And if I shoot them with a gun, it's not a good scene for me. It's not like other states where you can defend yourself. So, the NRA, like you can, like if I was a member and I defended myself in my own home from somebody with a fire, with using one of my firearms, the NRA, like, by being a member would help me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But other than that, I've never really felt the impulse to be a member.
So if I said, Saul, why do you own guns? What would you say?
So it's different reasons for different guns. I own my shotguns and my rifles for hunting.
Okay.
I own my pistols I have, like an heirloom. I have my great uncle's service pistol.
Yeah.
And I was actually thinking about that before I came over today. Like, can I argue why I own a pistol that's not a family heirloom? And I don't really have a great argument for it.
Right.
I like shooting it.
Right.
The only time I ever carry it is also utilitarian. It's when I'm like taking a pile of deer meat that I'm not using and I'm, putting it in the woods. I'll go shoot a deer. I leave the guts in the woods on my friend's property. And then I'm butchering the deer, anything I'm not going to use, like, fat or anything from like the wound channel, that all goes in a bucket. And then I go and dump that on top of the gut pile. I take my pistol with me because if there's a bear on the gut pile, then
I get that. Yeah.
I want to I'm not going to take my rifle because, but I'll put my pistol on my hip. So that's like really so what does that mean? That I have that pistol so that I can put it on my hip like once or twice a year?
That and the family heirloom. So you have two guns that you've given me clear-cut answers for why you have them.
Oh, but my long guns are for hunting.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so then.
Yeah, so purely utilitarian. Yeah, those are the best arguments I can make, is purely utilitarian and then the heirloom.
And so are there any that you own purely because you like them? Purely for pleasure? That really don't serve a utilitarian purpose in your life?
No, I mean, my 9mm pistol serves the least utilitarian purpose.
Is that, and that's the one
That's the one I would take with me into the woods on my hip. And that's what I was thinking about before I came over today. Like, can I make a real argument for why I own it? Before I got my bow, I used to shoot it a lot more. And that's when it would be more of like something where I was enjoying the sport operating a firearm,
right?
Well, where it becomes like a meditative practice. But now I shoot my bow for that reason.
Interesting. And does the number of mass shootings in recent times, has that shifted your stance at all, or shifted your sort of like openness to having a conversation about more restrictions?
No, I mean, I've always been open to that conversation. Right after Uvalde happened, before I knew any details, like before I knew about the cops, before I knew about the duration of the event, I was like, all right, like it's time for them to just do a big, like we have to figure out how to get semi-automatic rifles off the street.
Right.
But, since then, I just think that like if they were to do a massive gun grab or buyback, I think that it would further exacerbate the problem of the divisiveness, like the cultural divide in this country. Mm-hmm. I said it earlier that, you might save some lives.
Right.
But I think that you would be doing, I guess I've never like articulated this, but I think that you would be doing more damage.
Right.
You'd be driving a larger wedge between.
Because you'd be pissing off so many people who love their guns.
So many people.
Right.
Yeah.
If the next mass shooting is 25 kids and there's a semi-automatic involved, do you think that will make you say, okay, we need to, or do you think it'll just be like,
oh, no, I'm there now.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm like anxiously awaiting some legislator to be like, we finally talked to everybody across the spectrum.
Right.
And we came up with a bill that isn't going to like alienate the gun owners because we're saying crazy stuff that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Like the AR and AR-15 does not mean assault rifle 15.
Right.
It's a brand thing.
Okay.
But I talk to people that are like, these AR-15, these assault rifle 15s. It's like, all right, if you talk like that to a gun owner, they're immediately going to put up a wall because they know that you like don't understand anything in their world.
Yeah. I hear you about that. I mean, you've said that a lot. And I feel like, I don't know if it's my obligation to have to be conversant in the fine points of firearms in order to like have a common sense understanding and insight into what should and shouldn't be legal.
But it's not about being like well-versed. It's about just like talking to one person before they like release something to the press, like having one person on their staff that can be like,
of course.
That doesn't make sense. That
right.
Okay. It's not about like,
I hear you.
I hear that. That like AOC needs to go join like an AR-15 shooting.
Right. It's just like somebody on her PR team, somebody who's conversing with the public needs to be able to
at least pretend,
Yeah. You just are.
I mean, it's just like,
the idea that
like all the stuff that just happened in New York, the laws that came out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that any of those are really going to be like the law that saves all of the lives.
For sure.
I think that they're pretty marginal.
But we also just have to start somewhere.
Sure. Yeah. I can buy into that. I'm anxiously awaiting the one where I read the headline and I'm like, holy shit, like that's actually going to save some lives.
I mean, honestly, like the answer that I have come to about a lot of what's wrong with this country after thinking about it and doing a ton of research about it is that really that the stories that we have been taught about who we are and what America is are really, really messed up. And as a result, we've been open to be manipulated by and believe that we need to behave in certain ways in order to be certain kinds of humans. And it's so deeply ingrained because of the culture, because of the narrative, the cultural narratives that have been imposed on us by capitalism, by like literally like captains of industry and like the government in some ways. Like, I don't think the government wishes us ill, but I do think that like the patriotic narrative that has been like told in support of aggressive wars and all kinds of stuff, right? Like there are just all these stories that we've been told that we identify with that aren't necessarily, not only are they not necessarily ours, but they're also like, they're very, very divisive. They pit people against each other and they also make it really hard for people to kind of like see common sense, right? Like if you love guns and you associate guns with God and America and freedom and country, and that's like what you believe in your core, it's very hard to convince somebody that that story was taught people by their culture, by their schools, by, right? Like, but the stories are what have to shift, right? The stories people are told about who they are And the language, the way that we use, I've become very sensitive to the fact that people are constantly talking about defeat and winning and right. There's this total constant adversarial language being used that is kind of the language of war all the time.
It's always a zero-sum game.
And it's just never a zero-sum game. But we talk as if it is, and then we think as if it is.
Yeah.
And that makes everything all or nothing, right? That makes your whole orientation be you're either a winner or a loser, right? It's just super, and people are not simple, actually, right? People are complicated.
Yeah.
I think.
No, it's a great point. You're either the perpetrator or you're the victim.
Right.
There's no room to just be a human being.
I do think that the way we've been taught to use language, and specifically warlike language and the language of adversarial language, is often incorrect. It's not actually descriptive, but it kind of puts us in this constant competitive mindset.
Yeah. In English, it's all noun-based, I.
Right.
I am Saul.
Right.
That's actually not really true. I'm more like a verb at any given moment.
Yeah.
So that was my friend Saul. I'm glad we talked, because it took me from thinking of Saul as pro-gun and me as anti-gun to thinking we actually have a lot of common ground about guns. He agrees this hellfire stealth thing has to go. He doesn't think people who are mentally disturbed should be allowed to buy guns. And he thinks everyone who wants to shoot a gun needs to be well educated about gun safety. But I get why Saul loves his guns too. He's a hunter. He digs the whole primal, dude in the woods stalking prey thing. That's his jam. And if I'm being totally honest, I think he would secretly still love to own a semi-automatic rifle. I do. I think he'd be very psyched to shoot feral hogs from a helicopter with an AR-15. And I think he'd be very happy to make some feral hog sausage afterwards. But he's also made it clear that he's not going to go buy an AR-15, and that he's so sick of watching kids die in mass shootings here in America that he'd be willing to give up all of his guns if the court said he had to. As for me, I still think semi-automatic weapons should be banned. And until they're banned, I think people who want to buy semi-automatic weapons should be required to pass a mandatory mental health exam beforehand. But I also take Saul's point about the communication problem between those of us who want stricter gun laws and those who don't. I get how annoying it must be to have a bunch of folks who don't know anything about guns trying to tell users what is and isn't safe, what should and shouldn't be legal. Personally, I kind of bristle at the idea that I'd have to become a gun techie in order to convince gun owners that we need tighter gun laws. But I think from a pragmatic perspective, Saul has a point. If we gunphobes are going to have conversations about gun laws with gun owners, we may get farther if we learn enough about gun technology to actually earn the respect of the gun-owning population. And that feels like maybe the start of a bridge to me, like the end of a pro-gun, anti-gun debate, and the beginning of something more nuanced. Call it a conversation. Okay, that's it for today's show, you guys. Thanks so much for joining me on The Control Variable. See you next time. Guys, if you like the show, please be sure to go rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps. And be honest, okay? Tell us what you liked. Tell us what you didn't like, what annoyed the hell out of you, what you want to hear more of. I'll listen. I promise. We're in this together, okay? Let's make something amazing. The Control Variable is brought to you by Atomic Whale Studios and executive produced by Jonathan Wilson. The podcast was created by Jonathan, Brian Blatstein, and me. Brian Blatstein is the supervising producer. Rob Okendo and I are producers of the podcast. The technical producer and supervising editor is Derek Michaud of Shelby Rowe Productions. Sound editing is by Alex Aerosmith, and technical support is provided by Eric Totora Patu. Website creative direction by Randy Brasoff. Original music was composed and performed by Dan White. The Control Variable is managed by Sean Madison. Fact-checking by Kelly Stakopoulos. Megan Petta is our researcher, guest coordinator, and the person who keeps the Control Variable train on the tracks every day. Finally, I'm your writer and host, Kim Cutter. A very special thanks to everyone who made our show possible.